Good morning. In the mid-1980s, I worked at St Vincent's Hospital in the Department of Immunology. I was working on allergies and some research into allergies. Work that didn't progress very far for a range of reasons, not the least of which was the outset of the AIDS epidemic. And my boss had been in Boston, and he was studying allergies and atopic disease there when AIDS was first diagnosed or defined, discovered in New York City. And he was at the forefront, really, of being engaged in the research and the diagnostic tools and the early work on AIDS. And he brought that back to Sydney, and they opened the first AIDS lab in Australia in our department. And it suddenly took off. And our department was filled with people who were treating the illness as they're able, diagnosing illness, epidemiologists, caring for patients, doing research into this illness. And it just flourished and blossomed, that work. It was huge. At the time, no one really understood the illness or the disease. They presumed it was a virus, but no one had identified the virus or defined the virus. It was a time when no one really understood how AIDS was transmitted, whether it was droplets of aerosols, bodily fluids, touch, what it was. They had ideas, but no one had proved anything. And so surrounding AIDS work and research was a lot of safety protocols, of using gloves and masks and gowns, working in biosafety hoods that protected the person working. And the patients in the hospital had their own wing, which was dedicated just to AIDS. And few people went there. There was a lot of fear and paranoia and concern around it. And so people who brought the meals would leave them at the door and not go in. The cleaners wouldn't go into the rooms for fear of this illness that they didn't understand. Nurses would have to gown up with full masks and gloves and gowns, and cover their whole body in case, just because they didn't know what was the transmission or how infectious it was. The main people who cared for the AIDS patients came out of the gay and lesbian community, the community that I guess was predominantly impacted, and other caring individuals who understood the isolation and the need for care and compassion. And they would go in and they would take the meals in and feed the person or help wash them or help clean the room or do whatever was necessary. But it was mainly giving that personal interaction and touch. And when people were dying, it was these people who sat with them as they lay in hospices dying and held their hands and prayed with them and cared for them as they died. What I realised was in AIDS, it wasn't just a physical illness, but it had spiritual and psychological and emotional consequences, as do many diseases. But AIDS also had a very significant social impact. It isolated the individual. Many diseases do isolate us, stop us from participating in the full life that we're normally used to or others are able to do. If I get the flu, I don't go to work. I don't participate in some activities that I might have been doing. If I had COVID, I isolate for a few days until the symptoms go away and I'm clear. Such is life with various illnesses. AIDS had an extra dimension. It wasn't just the debilitating nature of it, destroying a person's immune system and leaving them vulnerable to infections, but it was the social dynamic of the disease, that people feared those who had AIDS and the transmission of AIDS, that they might catch it. And so people with AIDS were pushed to the margins further and shunned, as are other people in life. And that is the nature of some types of illness. I know my mother was going through cancer around that time. She'd been diagnosed and she lived with it for 2 years before she died. But in that time when she was receiving treatments and other things, there were a number of people gathered around her and couldn't do enough for her. Came in and supported her and walked with her and helped her. But there were others who couldn't cope, who resisted, who were afraid. I'm not sure whether they feared getting the illness themselves or whether they feared what it meant to talk to someone who was dying. but she was shunned by some. And the nature of the illness meant she couldn't do particular things. It stopped her participating in some activities of life, not everything. That's the nature of disease even in our world. In the first century, disease as a physical bodily illness was experienced but not fully understood as a biomedical disease as we would, with symptoms and so forth. It was really an illness which impacted the body, the mind, the spirit, and the social interactions in life. And depending on the nature of the illness and how it's manifested, people had rashes and skin lesions or other signs that they might be infectious. Not that they would see it as infectious. They were excluded and pushed to the margins of society. Illness had social and religious consequences as people understood it is surrounded by sin and cursing, and that people who were ill had perhaps upset God and were being punished, or it was because of their sin in their lives. And they were excluded and marginalised. And so the social impact of illness was quite serious. And Jesus took this on. Jesus took on the social impact of illness, which predominantly impacted the poorer people. The people who didn't have the resources of good food or the better food and nourishment and so forth, or what medicine did exist. These were the people who were left to the margins and pushed. And when they became sick, their exclusion meant they couldn't work, they couldn't get work or money, and life was difficult. And it was these people Jesus interacted with. And we see these stories early in Mark's story of Jesus, where Jesus engages with people who are sick, called demon-possessed or ill. There's the exorcism stories and the healing stories. And we should understand that healing in this time, in this way, and the true nature of healing is not just simply of a curing of disease, which may or may not happen. It's finding wholeness within one's being. And sometimes that wholeness means living in the light of this illness and disease, or disability, or whatever it is. Living fully and wholly. And Jesus embraced people who were sick or who had disabilities or whatever it was into the greater dynamic of a social community that was God's. And this was the healing nature. In the story we read this week, Jesus retreats out of the public space where he's healed this man who's demon-possessed, and people are amazed, and the synagogue rulers up in arms because he's done this on the Sabbath day, and in their mind that's against the law. And he retreats to a private space, a private house, Simon Peter's. But there, Simon Peter's mother-in-law is laid low with a fever. And we don't understand what the nature of this fever is. We're just told it was a fever. It could be life-threatening, it could be whatever it was. Its impact on her was to cut her off from the social life and dynamic of her community. It is to go in and to take her by the hand and lift her up. Instead of isolating her, a sick person, and keeping her isolated and away like those AIDS patients, he went in and embraced her and brought her back into the community. Her healing was restoration into her role and her life within the community, to be able to serve them, which was a significant thing for her and the community. This is the nature of Jesus' ministry and life. And it invites us to think about the people around us in our world. When I was in a particular congregation, there's a local school called a special school, special education school unit, where there are about 100 children and young people who live with intellectual disabilities and other physical and emotional disabilities that precluded them from the normal participation in life. And by extension, their families were often isolated as they cared for this child, which had significant needs, and there were therapy sessions and other things. But the child was vulnerable. And so this school provided special care and education, as they still do. And we were invited in as a church to participate and share and offer some programs that could work with the school and the programs they were doing. One of them was to invite the senior class, a dozen or so kids, to come down and participate in a craft group that the church ran through the day. And the young people would engage with other adults and talk and share story, but also learn some crafts, some painting or drawing or knitting or making cards or playing carpet bowls or other games. And they loved it. And it was a two-way interaction because the adults experienced these group of young people that they would not normally encounter. And they saw a different world opening up, these hidden people, these hidden young people and people in our society who live with intellectual disabilities and other disabilities. They're often hidden and silenced, but this brought them into the common life of these other adults, and there was a sharing, an engagement, and it was a safe place for these vulnerable young people to participate and provide what they could bring to that community. In another program, we ran an after-school drop-in centre for kids from the local high school. And so we would set it up earlier in the day, and some of the young people from the school would be bussed down, the special school, and they would be able to participate in regular activities with some of the adults from the church. Table tennis, there was a little basketball thing, there was disco, there were games, there were things that they could do that perhaps they would not normally have the opportunity to participate in. And it embraced them into a wider community and enabled us to experience these young people and the gifts that they brought. And I went into the school and would do scripture, which was very simple. We'd often just sing songs and tell a simple story. And there was one little guy it was just lovely. He loved music. And he was like, sing song. And I'd start playing the guitar and, no, other song. And I'd have to work out which song he wanted. And when he did, yeah, and he'd sing along and clap and jump around, and we'd have to sing it. It was just lovely. It did a lot for me as it did for him. It was wonderful. And the young people loved the music and loved other faces, other adults, other people. I also went into a dementia unit in the local nursing home and ran a monthly service. It was again very simple. There was a simple prayer. We sang a lot of hymns and gospel songs that they might know, and there was a simple story. And some of these people, when I went in, would just be lost in their own little world. But when we started playing music and singing hymns that they remembered, they would become animated. And they would sing all the words, and they would know all the words and sing and clap along and be really involved. It was a community in that space, and they loved it. And it was special. I got a lot from it. It was us together. And what I learned was when we open ourselves up and embrace the marginalised and the outcast and the people on the margins and those who are socially isolated by illness or disability or whatever it is, and welcome them into the community as they are, we gain as much as they do, or perhaps more. And we become real. It's a real community in which everyone has a part. And I think this is what Jesus was on about, welcoming everybody into this community of God's grace and love, where everyone could offer their part, their role, play their part, where the vulnerable could be cared for and nurtured, but they could love people back and provide hope and joy, where we could all share together in this place that was equal and bring the best of who we were to the flourishing of everyone. I think that's what Jesus and the dynamic of his ministry was about, embracing all into this community of God's grace and love. And I think that's what we're invited into, bringing all we are and in welcoming all in everyone else into this community. And the world is changed and transformed when this love is shared. Amen.